Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Which branch of American government is fueled by raw political issues? Which is guided by almost pure partisanship? Which is motivated principally by ideology? The Supreme Court, says James Zirin, in his just released Supremely Partisan, How Raw Politics Tips the Scales in the United States Supreme Court. Jim is a major litigator, a former assistant U.S. attorney for New York Southern District, a television host, and author of Mother Court, Tales of Cases That Mattered in America's Greatest Trial Court. Welcome back, Jim.
I'm delighted to be back with you, Doug.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure. Now, in the second presidential debate, Beth Miller asked, quote, perhaps the most important aspect of this election is a Supreme Court justice. Would you prioritize the most important aspect of selecting a Supreme Court justice? Let me turn the question. She asked it of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and we'll talk later. How would you answer the question?
If I were Hillary Clinton or if I were Donald
If you're
Trump?
Jim Zirin.
Well, if I were Jim Zirin, which I am, I would answer it that I would appoint judges of extraordinary competence in the law, of diverse experience in their lives, on which they can draw in deciding these very important cases, and people of stature. I would look for someone probably in their 50s because they would sit on the court for decades to come. And I would realize that, particularly in that there's a vacancy now with the death of Justice Scalia, that if a liberally oriented justice is appointed, it would tip the scales of the court in favor of the liberal wing. And if a conservative were appointed, they'll never replace Scalia. They'll never find anyone like him. Right. They made him and threw away the mold. But if a conservative is appointed, we would more often than not get conservative outcomes in the decisions of the Supreme Court.
Now, what would these decisions be? What are the key decisions that have been recently decided and can be overruled, and upcoming cases? What's at stake here?
I think Hillary Clinton referred to them in terms of the decisions of the Roberts Court.
Right.
Clearly reproductive rights, abortion rights, certainly voting rights in the South. There was the Shelby County case decided 5-4.
I know.
There is the gay marriage, which might be overruled. And
I want you to comment on gay marriage at the end.
There is the Second Amendment, the right to carry a gun. I think to bear arms, she referred to that as important. Freedom of religion and how it interrelates with a division between church and state. 5-4 decision of the Roberts Court came down in favor of church rather than state. Mm-hmm. And there are probably a host of other issues. Affirmative action right. Immediately comes to mind.
Okay. Now, Jim Zirin again. If you were to pick the justices, where would you become part of this partisan court? Or would you attempt to talk about the ideal approach and the real approach?
Well, there are two issues, Doug. The first is partisanship in the appointment of the judge. Right. And secondly, partisanship in terms of how they decide the cases. Right. The judges that are appointed by Republican presidents, the 5 conservative justices when Scalia was around, all appointed by Republican presidents. The 4 liberal justices who remain, all appointed by Democratic presidents. Now, it's not that Ruth Bader Ginsburg thinks to herself, how would Bill Clinton have wanted me to decide this case. But as Scalia used to say, that's why she was put there, because Clinton knew that she was someone of a certain philosophy. She'd been an advocate for women's rights. She was going to take certain positions in cases that had a values field of them, preferred policy choices field of them, where the Constitution in its majestic ambiguity doesn't immediately suggest what the outcome should be.
Okay, now you said that no matter who the president is of the 2016 election, the Supreme Court will continue to be a very political court where recent precedent is overruled or sterilized to accommodate an ideological agenda. You still believe that?
Yes, I do.
And in fact, the answers to the questions would confirm your statement.
Yes, I think that if Trump has put forward, I think at least 21 names as people from whom he would
he wants to find a Scalia.
And he says he wants to find a Scalia. As I said, he will not. But if he'll try to find someone who shares some of the values of Scalia, one justice who's a federal judge, in fact, the leading candidates are all federal appellate judges, as it happens, appointed by George W. Bush. And one of them actually said that he considers Roe v. Wade to be an abomination, which must be overruled.
Is he a Catholic?
He is a Catholic. He's a devout Catholic.
Let's get into some of the seats: the Catholic seat, the Jewish seat, the black seat, the women's seat. Let's talk about Catholics. They were with Scalia, 5 of the 6 justices who were Catholic, and with Scalia's death, it's 4-1. Sotomayor being the other. They are. It's almost as if you say Catholic, and the odds are overwhelming that they're going to fall in a certain direction. What is it about Catholic?
Well, Scalia used to say that if his faith came into conflict with his constitutional duty, he would resign. He said never has.
Right.
And he proceeded to give an argument as to how the Catholic Church, contrary to what the Pope says, authorizes capital punishment, which he was highly in favor of, and which the Pope is not. And he said that what the Pope said is simply an encyclical. It's not. He wasn't speaking ex cathedra in faith and morals, which is binding on every Catholic. This is merely something I must consider. I've considered it and I reject it. So
he's more Catholic than the Pope.
More
Come on.
Catholic than the Pope, and I have a chapter on that. So it is not to say that one's Catholicism necessarily informs the judge's view of a case. After all, Brennan voted with the majority in Roe v. Wade. He was a devout Catholic. And
Murphy, I mean, going back
to Murphy in the Roosevelt era, he was as strong a liberal as one could imagine.
But the Catholics on the court now are the most conservative, based on a listing of cases that one could agree of liberal, conservative, and go down the list. I mean, Thomas and Alito.
Except for Sotomayor
that's right.
And sometimes Kennedy. Kennedy seems to vote for abortion rights when the issue is presented. And he also wrote the opinion in the gay marriage case.
Right.
And has consistently voted for gay rights.
Right. The next couple of years, we're going to have 3 appointments, possibly 4, maybe.
That's right.
What could be the dynamic in the court? Let's say Clinton wins the election. She's got to nominate a justice. What's going to happen? I mean, we don't know, but speculate.
Well, the first issue is what's going to happen to Merrick Garland. His nomination by Obama has been stalled in the Senate, blocked, because Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that the next justice should be elected by the American people.
Why?
Which is just what the Constitution says he shouldn't be.
Right.
He's nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. I think it was illegal for Garland to say they wouldn't even hold hearings although probably if there were hearings, Garland would have been voted down by a Republican majority, particularly in an election year. This is wrong because, in my view, because it simply underscores and intensifies the politicization of the judiciary. So the question is, if Hillary is elected, will the Republicans reason that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know? Because if they continue to block Garland, will Hillary come in and appoint someone who's far more liberal than Garland? Garland is viewed as a more moderate judge.
But if she does that, they stonewall it. They reject it. Bork.
If they bork Garland and he's rejected, the next question is, are you going to have a Democratic or Republican Senate? If you have a Democratic Senate, all of her nominees sail in. And
maybe. I mean, there's some division within the conference, but essentially, yes.
Essentially, yes. I mean, they vote. The way our Congress works is they largely vote with the leadership. We don't see a lot of profiles and courage coming out of the United States Senate.
Or the House.
Or the House, either, for that matter.
Let's focus on the Roberts Court. It has a string of what I would consider adverse decisions. Death knell for affirmative action, gutted voting rights, chipped away at reproductive freedom, prayer in the schools, death penalty. What are some of the counterexamples of cases with that majority or members of the majority that went against the ideological flow?
Well, first place, ideology, whether informed by religion or ethnicity or gender, enters into every decision, in my view, where the Constitution doesn't provide a clear answer.
Right.
So if the issue were, should there be 2 senators from every state, of course they would all vote that there should be 2 senators from every state, and that issue would never come up. But where you're dealing with concepts like due process of law, concepts like equal protection of the law, even concepts like cruel and unusual punishment.
Let alone privacy.
And let alone privacy. The Constitution doesn't mention privacy. Cruel and unusual punishment. Does that mean cruel and unusual in 1789?
Right.
Or in 1791 when the amendment was ratified? Or does it mean today? Now, in 1791, you were put in the stocks for kissing your wife on Sunday. In 1791, we hanged people for stealing horses. Now, I don't think any federal judge today would sustain such a sentence. Scalia said, well, if we threw someone in the stocks or pulled his nails out, and they did it at the time of the Constitution, it would be a stupid law, but it would be constitutional. Most people don't agree. Most judges wouldn't agree. And I don't think Scalia, if it ever came up, which it wouldn't, would agree either.
Yes. Regale us with the oral argument in Obergefell and Hodges, the gay marriage case.
Well, Scalia was an arch foe of gay rights. He thought homosexuality was immoral. He did not think homosexuals should be fully integrated into our society. They shouldn't be teachers or scoutmasters or anything else that brought them into contact with children or with normal individuals. So in his dissent, and just to backtrack, in Lawrence v. Fox, which is in the 1970s, where the majority held that the state of Texas, Lawrence v. Texas, could not criminalize homosexual behavior between consenting adults. Scalia dissented, and he said in his dissent, just you wait and see what's going to happen. The next thing that's going to happen is this court is going to legalize gay marriage. So then you have this 5-4 decision in which Scalia dissents. And in the course of the oral argument, a man got up in the courtroom and he began to scream and yell and demonstrate. And the marshals immediately ran over to him, tackled him, and dragged him out of the courtroom. And as they were dragging him out of the courtroom, he shouted at the top of his lungs, "You're all going to roast in hell for this." And Scalia said, hushed courtroom, said, I find that rather refreshing.
But in losing Scalia, you lost a conservative's touchstone, an anchor for that court. We haven't had many decisions because of the deadlock court. What impact would it have? Well, it all depends on who replaces him. Trump. Who does he replace him with?
Well, assuming it's not Rudy Giuliani or Chris Christie.
Are you serious? You're joking.
He will. I would hope that he would replace him with some of the leaders from the list who are respected, at least respected by conservatives, respected jurists. The leaders are all from the Midwest. The leaders were all Bush appointees. They all seem to come from states that Trump would like to carry because they're battleground states. For example, there's a wonderful conservative federal judge named Brett Kavanaugh from the D.C. Circuit, who was appointed by Bush, who was conspicuously absent from Trump's list. And he's in his 50s and would make an admirable Supreme Court justice. What is interesting about the history of so-called conservative appointments to the court, remember Eisenhower, a Republican, appointed Warren and Brennan, and said they were the two greatest mistakes of his presidency. Right. You have people like Potter Stewart and Lewis Powell, appointed by Republican presidents, and they became moderates. David Souter is a great example of a moderate who was appointed by a Republican president. So a president can often be surprised by a Supreme Court justice.
But hasn't been surprised recently.
Or she appoints. The only case of a liberal president who appointed a justice who became conservative is Byron White, who was appointed by John F. Kennedy.
Right. You say that the court is afflicted by identity politics. What is identity politics, and how does it impact on the approach and work of the court?
Great question for City Talk, because you remember in the old days when the political bosses wanted to put out a slate for mayor. It was Lefkowitz, Gilhooly, and Fino against O'Connor, Beam, and Procaccino.
Right. So the elections of the 60s were all like that.
We are in a pluralistic society, and the way our political system has always worked, that there has to be a certain amount of power sharing. Now, that hasn't always been the case. When Abe Fortas in 1969 resigned, and as a result of a scandal, resigned in disgrace, Nixon had to make an appointment. And John Mitchell, the Attorney General, this is on the White House tapes, talked to Nixon and said, we have to appoint a Jew to the Jewish seat. And so Nixon said, well, no, I'm going to appoint Blackman. And Mitchell said, well, he's a Protestant. And he said, when are you going to appoint a Jew? And Nixon said, after I'm dead. So it hasn't always been the case that politicians have felt that they had
and he referred to Rehnquist as Lynchburg on the tapes.
Well, I think so. So but that was Nixon. Today, let's say that as of the time that Scalia died, we had 6 Catholics and 3 Jews on the court. And if Garland replaces Scalia, there'll be 4 Jews on the court. And no one seems to mind that there'll be 4 Jews on the court. At the time of Brandeis and Cardozo, it was a serious issue.
Yes. What happens when you don't have any WASPs on the court?
That's now 100% minority.
Now, you're in favor of WASP on the court. Why?
I'm in favor of diversity, and I don't think that the president should at least publicly say, I'm going out with a lantern looking for a Jew or a WASP or a Catholic or an African American. But they do consider this, and we've had 112 justices on the United States Supreme Court. 89 of them have been white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. They brought us Brown v. Board of Education. They brought us the free speech cases, cases that established rights of African Americans in the South and elsewhere. So I don't think that you can necessarily assume that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males are going to be conservatives. Roosevelt didn't like what a number of them were doing, tried to pack the court.
Yes.
But even with that, he appointed people like Black and Douglas,
Yep.
who were staunch liberals.
Moving forward, what are cases that are out there looming, and no matter who is appointed in the Scalia seat, is going to have a profound impact? Are there any hot cases out there?
Well, I think there will be an effort made to overrule Citizens United, which Hillary Clinton referred to in the debate, the campaign finance case, which has been criticized because it opens the floodgates for big money in politics.
Yeah, you called it the second most partisan decision that the court had made recently. Bush v. Gore being the most outrageous.
Well, both cases where the court has entered into the field of partisan politics. In Bush v. Gore, they decided the election, although it probably would have been decided in the same way had there been a complete recount. In Florida, at least New York Times did it afterwards. But it was 5-4, and it was a political decision, a decision that Sandra Day O'Connor said later she regretted.
Yeah. Too
and
late.
It's a decision that really stands for nothing. It wasn't a judicial decision. It was a partisan decision. Citizens United 5-4, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg said was a perfectly dreadful decision.
That was the worst decision of a tenure.
That's right. And so it's because the presence of big money in politics really alters the political calculus in both political branches of government, the Congress and the president.
Go back to Obergefell versus Hodges, the gay marriage case. You argue that they basically pulled the right out of the air. It was they had personal preferences and ideological reasons, etc., but there was nothing in the Constitution that could recognize that.
Yes, because the Constitution does not mention marriage, let alone gay marriage. Certainly, if you'd asked anyone at the time of the Constitution in 1789 or 1791 whether they were intending or they understood that they were creating a right of gay marriage, they would have been horrified. And what was used to sustain it was the 14th Amendment in 1868. And Scalia had a very funny dissent in the case where he said, how is it that this right that was lurking in the Constitution was something that would have shocked Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louis Brandeis, or Henry Friendly?
Yeah.
It would have been unknown to them. And the first country to legalize gay marriage was the Netherlands in the year 2000. And at the time of the decision, most of the states had not yet legalized it.
Yep.
But it's really, I mean, one of the important considerations was that you needed a uniform national rule, because if you were left to the states, what do you do about the couple that marries legally in New York and then moves to Alabama? Right. Secondly, it was thought that societal attitudes had changed so dramatically so that there was great acceptance for this and great understanding among people that which Scalia said was part of the culture wars.
Right.
But there was a shared understanding that this would be permissible and was part of a human being's right of dignity, the right to marry.
Okay.
So Kennedy found that in the Constitution.
Yes.
But so in Roberts, in his dissent, said, number one, who do we think we are to create such a right?
Right.
And he said that this was a great victory for gay rights, but not a great victory for the Constitution.
Let me end in a sense with my favorite justice, Clarence Thomas. Could you speak to him?
Well, I find him to be quite problematical. He was appointed to a black seat to replace the iconic Thurgood Marshall, and yet he's managed to vote against black interests every time they're presented to the court. He has not often asked a question, more than a decade past, where he didn't ask a single question. He was a conservative when he was appointed to the bench. He's the most conservative justice, even more conservative than, oh yes, and even more than Scalia. I mean, Scalia, talking of Thomas, said once, I may be an originalist, but I'm not a nut. And so Thomas believes in natural law. He believes in the text of the Constitution. If you can't find it in the text, it's not there. And but it goes beyond that, because the most recent decision involved the selection of a jury in Georgia, where a black defendant was sentenced to death.
An all-white jury.
An all-white jury, and where they uncovered documents that conclusively showed that the prosecutor was exercising challenges to exclude blacks from the jury. And Thomas voted was the only justice, only one, who voted to sustain the conviction.
Can you speculate what motivates him?
It's really hard to understand. One of the things that motivates him is anger at the whole system. And so
sounds familiar.
And maybe it arose out of, I'm certain it arose out of his background, which was, he said in his book, my grandfather's son. He was raised by his grandfather. Right. I'm an ordinary man to whom extraordinary things happen, but he came from a background of extreme poverty, and something happened to him because normally, or quite often, people like Sotomayor, who came from a similar kind of background, not identical by any means, but she grew up in the housing projects of the Bronx, and went to Princeton, and she said, I'm an affirmative action baby. He said he was humiliated because he went to Yale Law School because of affirmative action. So he gave it a different twist.
Okay, we've got very little time. Look ahead a year, and what do you see in the court?
Well, Will Rogers said that the Supreme Court follows the election returns. So it depends on who was elected. The supposition is that Hillary will be elected, being so far ahead of the polls now. And if she's elected, we'll probably have, we'll certainly have the Scalia seat. Maybe it'll be filled by Garland, even before she takes office. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg is in her 80s. She says she's vigorous. She may retire, particularly if there's a Democratic Senate. And then you have two others who are 79, Breyer and Kennedy. So that is going to govern the ideological direction of the court for decades to come.
Okay. My thanks to Jim Zirin for his serious look at the history of one of America's greatest institutions, the Supreme Court. Supremely partisan, how raw politics tips the scale in the United States Supreme Court. It's a great read. Check out Jim's show, Conversations in a Digital Age, for more good conversation. Join me in 2 weeks when we continue to discuss with wonder the 2016 presidential election here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.